Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Kimberly Dozier. The Christmas Day attempted bombing of an international flight by Nigerian student Farouk Abdulmutallab with alleged ties to Yemen has opened up speculation about a country in the Arabian Peninsula. Is Yemen the new Afghanistan? And what must the United States do to combat al-Qaeda there? I'm joined by CBS News' Sheila MacVicar in London and Marisa Porges, an international affairs fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Sheila, in London. Now, Sheila, I know that you are following this investigation as it develops. So can we start there before we move on to Yemen? What's the latest that you've heard about the suspect, Abdulmutallab?
Hi, Kimberly. Well, I've just been speaking to someone who was at school here at University College London, UCL, with Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, somebody, in fact, who had been the president of the Islamic Society in 2006, the year before Abdulmutallab took the presidency in 2007. They were not just colleagues. They didn't just work together on this Islamic Society and its events. They were also friends. They met together. They talked about football. They talked about classes. They talked about their futures. One thing that this young man said to me is that in the recent days, he's been thinking very, very hard about what might have happened to the young man who was his friend. He says there was nothing that he saw here, that his positions were not extreme, that he did not in any way raise eyebrows in what would be a pretty mainstream Islamic society. And in the view of this young man, whatever happened to Abdulmutallab happened to him in the intellectual, psychological sense after he left London. And over the course of the last couple of days, we really have been focusing down very much harder on that period from June 2008, when he graduates from school here, until, of course, December 24th, and looking in particular at that period of time in Yemen.
Now, Marisa, you spent some time recently in Yemen. Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula has claimed responsibility for this attack in an internet posting, which has not been verified in any way. But we look at the time that the student spent there and this claim of responsibility. How might he have made the connection? What's going on the ground in Yemen?
Well, it's important to consider the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula problem in the larger context of what's going on in Yemen. I mean, you have a very unstable situation there, a country on the verge of state failure with significant domestic problems, the Houthi rebellion in the north, the southern secessionist movement in the south, and vast economic problems, underemployment, unemployment at 40%, economic woes that are growing by the month, and a situation where the radicalization of youth, there's a lot of potential for that. You add on top of that a layer where there's been for years an ideological apathy, if not support for, Al-Qaeda, sentiments writ large, Imam University being one potential source of radicalization in Sana'a. And you see that there's a lot of possibilities for connections to be made. I don't know how it happened in this situation. There's been reports that, he went to Sana'a to study Arabic. Who's to say what happened when he was on the ground there? And I think we'll see that play out in the coming weeks. But the tenuous connection that's currently being investigated seems to be legitimate. I mean, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula posted pictures of Mutallab on the internet, showing him in front of one of their postings. So, we'll see how that plays out, and hopefully we'll begin to understand just how the process of radicalization took place for him, because it'll inform how that might happen again in the future on a wider basis.
Now, of course, we know that from Yemeni officials that the U.S. has been part of the Yemen counterterrorist effort there. We've heard of U.S. involvement in airstrikes December 17th and Christmas Eve. And I know from U.S. officials that counterterrorist training, which, of course, you've been following, Sheila, has been going on by U.S. forces of Yemeni forces since the USS Cole bombing. So I guess the philosophical question would be, why hasn't it worked? Why was this still a base of operations for al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula? How were they able to find a home there?
Well, I think as Melissa has described, Yemen is a pretty chaotic situation with a very weak central government. It's also contending with a very powerful force in the form of a merged al-Qaeda. if you look back just a very short period of time, in 2008 in next door Saudi Arabia, al-Qaeda militants were under tremendous pressure. And in late 2008, the senior commanders of al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia ordered their militants over the border into the safe haven of Yemen. In January 2009, just a little less than a year ago, those two entities, al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia and al-Qaeda in Yemen, merged to form al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And what you have brought together there is not just two experienced organizations, but two organizations who've come together who have experienced military commanders, experienced tacticians, can think strategically, and have shown they have a capacity to innovate. In going back and looking at the number of attacks that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have carried out, either on the ground in Yemen against foreigners, an attack, a very audacious attempt at a suicide attack against the head of Saudi counterterrorism in August, or this attack, you can see that they are thinking, they are developing, they are working very hard on sort of analyzing the security obstacles that they face to reach their objectives and finding ways to try to go around that. So you've got a group that is together that is strategically and militarily, in a sense, extremely talented. Although in this instance, it's not like Afghanistan in that the Yemeni government is an ally of the United States and has been looking to the U.S. and other Western nations for support and help, especially since the bombing of the Cole in 2000. What you do have is an intellectual environment and a safe haven beyond the reach of that weak government that is almost a pre-9/11 Afghanistan-like environment.
And yet what we're hearing from news reports and Yemeni officials is that with this help, they've managed to take out some major targets, some top AQAP leaders. So why hasn't that helped stopper some of this violence? I mean, you and I were talking a bit before the show. Your prescription would be a little bit different.
Well, it would. And I think, before we get to that, it's important to also recognize, going back to what Sheila said, that it's not just the operations that have been expanding over the past, since January 2009, when AQAP declared themselves a regional power. I mean, they've also been strategically spreading the ideology and their messaging to, frankly, be able to have a long-term influence in Yemen and possibly use Yemen as a long-term source of support and base both for recruiting and training and operations. I mean, you see them trying to build associations and ties with the tribes in Marib and Jarif and Shuwaif, the historical locations where they've been for the past couple of years, even intermarrying into local communities so that now you have, local support that's intermixed with al-Qaeda. You also see them tailoring their messaging to account for local grievances, not necessarily always going back to the standard al-Qaeda propaganda, but trying to acknowledge the Southern secessionist movement, acknowledge problems that the locals are seeing, so that al-Qaeda becomes applicable to a populace that, if not, apathetic or supportive of al-Qaeda in the past, might become more so now. So I wholly support what Sheila was saying in terms of how the operations have grown recently and how the strategizing has expanded as of late. But to get to, what's to be done about it and how to move forward, I think it requires both the tactical operations we've seen recently, which reportedly, they were targeting al-Qaeda's leadership, including the cleric allegedly tied to the Fort Hood shootings, and we're still waiting to see, how successful they
forensic evidence to see whether al-Awlaki did get taken out.
Exactly. But beyond the tactical operations, I think we need to start working towards a longer-term strategic view, something that will take into account the strategic initiative that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has, the ideological messaging that's been going on, and has a potentially long-term effect on both the radicalization and the overall situation in Yemen that won't make Yemen such an attractive safe haven for the future.
But what I'm hearing you saying is a lot of the stuff that I've heard about Afghanistan, that this solution isn't just a counter-terrorist solution. You have to have a certain degree of counterinsurgency. You've got to have some nation building on the ground, some development, legitimate government to replace whatever is either attracting people to the al-Qaeda movement or driving them away from their own government. So that brings us to the question of how many places do you have to fix to eradicate al-Qaeda?
No, and the there's a couple key elements here that go to exactly what you're saying. But one is to recognize that Al-Qaeda isn't necessarily a priority for the Yemeni government. It's they have enough internal problems at the moment with, two domestic conflicts and, vast economic problems and, growing, verging state failure, that Al-Qaeda isn't a domestic concern. It's a low priority for them, if one at all. I mean, they have been doing tactical operations at our behest, most likely. But we will never get rid of Al-Qaeda. I mean, it has served Yemenis to have the U.S. and the international community engage in Al-Qaeda, if and when Al-Qaeda is there. So in some regard, it doesn't serve their interest to get rid of Al-Qaeda at this point in the long term, unless we have a strategy for engaging on all topics, not just counterterrorism, but also some of the economic and domestic political problems they've seen there. And yes, it does begin to look a little more like Afghanistan and the counterinsurgency operations and some nation building that's gone on. And I think the key ends up being how to get the international community to support this effort and how to get regional players, primarily Saudi Arabia, to take a lead on this initiative in the future.
Now, Sheila, just to wrap up and end with you, we haven't heard a whole lot publicly about what the United States or the international community is doing on the ground with the Yemeni government. Do we have any more details? Do we have any word of what sort of operations they might be carrying out in the near future?
Well, Senator Joe Lieberman said the other day, acknowledging that there were U.S. Special Forces, U.S. Green Berets, and obviously intelligence operatives on the ground in Yemen, and that they are providing a whole variety of support, everything from counterterrorism training to training of Yemeni forces to weapons to probably helping with target selection at this point and providing intelligence or assisting in the provision of intelligence for target selection. We heard from the Yemeni foreign minister in an interview he did for CBS News the other day, talking about the support that Yemen has had from the United States, from the British, the French, the Germans, and others, and how much more support they need. The U.S. has been spending about $70 million a year in Yemen. That budget is certainly going to increase, and it will be both a covert and an overt operation. As Melissa said, one of the big issues in Yemen is the high level of unemployment and the attraction that leaves people open to all kinds of things, whether it's a rebellion in the north, a secessionist movement in the south, or whether it's Al-Qaeda.
Thanks, Sheila. An insight into Yemen that we now need, thanks to one young man, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who's brought our attention and the world's attention on that part of the Arabian Peninsula. I also want to thank Marisa Porges for helping us understand some of this little covered part of the world. And I want to thank you for watching Washington Unplugged throughout 2009. We'll be back in the new year with all that has made you come to CBSNews.com to watch. I'm Kimberly Dozier. Have a great New Year's. See you in 2010. Oh. You mean my, okay. It doesn't sound like me. Okay. Yeah. A little more oomph in it. All right. Thank you, Sheila. Brings us some insight into Yemen, a part of the world we don't normally cover. But thanks to the attack by one young man, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, someplace we'll be paying a lot more attention to. Marisa Porges, also want to thank you for bringing your insight and experience to our set. And we may be checking in again, I predict, in the new year. I also want to thank all of you for watching Washington Unplugged throughout 2009. We'll be back in the new year with all that's made you come to CBSNews.com to watch. I'm Kimberly Dozier. Have a great New Year's. See you in 2010.